of the session, Kathleen Coe.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, Ukrainian membership in the EU. Now, we've heard really, haven't we, some very powerful, very glowing, very emotional statements about it, haven't we, the last couple of days? Words like, you're a member of the family, you're a member of the European family, we want you in. And I know these words are so heartfelt and they're very sincere, but this is not simple. And there are others who are not quite in agreement with this. So this afternoon, we're going to discuss some of these concerns, how, as Ukraine begins to talk about reconstruction, how it can use those efforts to move its bid forward. Now, I've got a wonderful panel with me today to discuss it, so I will call everyone out. We will start with, I'm not sure exactly the order we have them in, but Aleš Šmelaš, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. Oleksandr Merezhko, Chair of the Committee on Foreign Policy and Interparliamentary Cooperation. Oh, actually, that's my chair, so if you would.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katarína Mathernová, Deputy Director General for Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement, the European Commission. And my good friend Kurt Volker, Distinguished Fellow of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Join us, Kurt. So I'll give Katarína a moment to get settled.
That's fine.
So thank you all for joining me this afternoon. Katarína, I'd love to start with you. Your president, Ursula von der Leyen, yesterday repeated what she said in her surprise visit to Ukraine in April, that it should be a member of the EU. She said, quote, "It is not only our strategic interest, but it is our moral duty to make it possible that they join our European Union and that we pave the path towards our union." But she did add that standards and conditions must be met. She said there's neither a wild card nor a shortcut. So you have your June 23rd, 24th summit coming up. Will there be a vote at that summit on granting Ukraine candidate status? And how hopeful are you for a positive outcome?
Well, I'm very hopeful for a positive outcome, and I'm delighted to be invited by Globsec, and I'm glad I read the same memo about the dress code with you. And
we coordinated well, didn't we?
Yes. And I'm not only optimistic because my big boss, my president of the commission, said that, but I truly, strongly believe that Ukraine needs a European perspective, not only because of what been happening in the last 100 days and the terrible war that Russia is raging, but it was actually entry into the EU that propelled the Maidan revolution. It was not about NATO membership, it was not about alliances, it was about being in the club of prosperous, democratic, stabilized countries. And that's what is a threat, that's the real threat to Putin. And so I do believe, and I do hope, that European leaders will see it this way and will grant a European perspective. But it's not
so there will be a vote.
They rarely vote. I mean, that's not how things happen. You sort of build consensus, and yes, every decision in the foreign policy field, and especially in the area of enlargement, is subject to unanimity. So there needs to be a consensus. I was asked by a journalist the other day, what happens if there is an inconclusive outcome? Well, inconclusive outcome means a no, right? Since you need unanimity. So I don't know whether it will come to actual voting. That's not how I think Aleš would be able to say how these things happen in the Council. But yes, there are some skeptical countries. There are countries that are skeptical because they think the bloc is too big already and it's unwieldy and it's going to be very difficult to incorporate Ukraine. There is still very strongly present the Russian narrative on corruption in Ukraine that they keep spreading. No, I'm the last one who would say there's no corruption in Ukraine, but I don't think it's out of the proportion with other places. But this has been very, very strongly present in the Russian disinformation warfare. And so there are the less you know Ukraine, the more reserved you are. And I think we have all discovered the reason why so many people were surprised that the Ukrainians are fighting back. It's because they didn't know Ukraine. So you do have these dangers, and hopefully over the next 2-3 weeks, those will be overcome.
Oleksandr, what is your reaction to that? Your president, in his remarks to the GlobeSec audience yesterday, said that if Ukraine was denied entry to the EU, and if Russia saw Europe as faint-hearted, he said it would be, quote, one of the gravest destabilizing factors for the continent over the entire period of the war.
Of course, I agree with my president for a number of reasons. First of all, it is true because for us, membership in the EU is important as a security guarantee because Putin is afraid of, most of all, solidarity, transatlantic solidarity and solidarity within European Union. If he feels that there is a strong force of the EU behind Ukraine, he will back down. And second reason, I'm sure that Ukraine has deserved to become EU member because it took us 2 revolutions, I mean Orange Revolution and Revolution of Dignity, and 1 long war, starting in the year 2014. So if it doesn't happen, I think it will be moral catastrophe for the European Union.
Aleš, I'd like to talk to you about some of the concerns that some countries have. One includes the fact that if you fast-track Ukraine's potential admission into the EU, that's unfair to other nations who have been waiting in the queue for years for membership. And then others are very worried about provoking Vladimir Putin. And obviously that's something no one wants to do, though it's hard to imagine the situation being worse, I know. Where does the Czech Republic stand on this?
Well, first of all, Czech Republic stands very much in favor of giving the candidate status to Ukraine and also to start negotiations and define the negotiation frameworks as soon as possible so that it could be a part of the reconstruction process. At the same time, we are starting 1st of July, we'll be chairing the Council of the EU in many formations. Not all working groups on in external action, but many of them. And we will need to work with the language that will be specified on the 23rd and 24th of June. So whatever language we hear, Czech Republic will need to work starting 1st of July with this type of language. What I think is extremely important, and you talked about the concerns, what is important is to say that there cannot be a denial of accession to the EU. It is also not, I would say, a prerogative of one session of the European Council to say something like that. I think that the real deal will be about the language and about the formulation, whether it is a European perspective, whether it is a sort of candidate status with conditions, or whether it will be some other language, which I really hope, and this is, I think, the key thing, will be understood in Ukraine as a positive gesture. About the concerns that you've mentioned, I think that what needs to be said, and all relevant institutions and member states have somehow supported this, and I think in Ukraine also it is somehow understood, is that we do not want to create a fast track or double track approach. The accession process needs to be merit-based, because without the work, without the reforms, the actual membership of the EU does not bring its benefits. And in this panel, will be my last point, but in this panel we talk about synergies with reconstruction and the EU candidate status or EU accession or EU perspective for Ukraine. And this is extremely important, because when we look at the state of devastation made by Russia in Ukraine, you can say that this is not, it could not be saved by public money. It needs to be private money. It needs to be companies investing in Ukraine heavily. And for this you need legal certainty. You need rule of law. You need to know how exactly laws work. And where else could it be or where else could it be done in a better way than inside the EU, where you have, I would say, mechanisms to see and abide to concrete rules, which would create this, I would say, confidence for private businesses to go to Ukraine and contribute to the reconstruction, which from public budgets and from EU budgets specifically would be very much difficult to finance.
Kurt, I'd love to go to you on the capacity argument. There are some who say the EU shouldn't expand until it gets its house in order. As it is, it's hard enough to get 27 countries to agree unanimously on anything, and that's the requirement right now with very, the most important decisions. What do you think about that?
Well, several things, and I'm going to pick up where Aleš left off, because if Ukraine is successful in terms of rule of law, you will attract investment, it will grow. This will make a healthier, stronger Ukraine, which is better for Europe. So I think it's wrong to look at these things as alternatives, or wrong to look at them as sequential, that we have to do this first and we have to do that.
In a vacuum, okay.
Yeah, basically, the framework I would give to this is that many people in Europe now realize the situation on the ground where Ukraine has defended itself and will survive and remain a sovereign, independent European democracy. This is critically important. There was some doubt about that, and so that is now clear. The next thing that people are seeing then is that Ukraine can be a contributor to Europe, rather than seeing this as Ukraine as a charity case, something we have to be repairing and supporting. Ukraine has the potential economically, in terms of human capital, in terms of industry and the diversity of industry, scale, size, agriculture, everything, to actually help Europe address European challenges. So it'll be a big benefit to Europe over time to bring in Ukraine. And then the third thing is that Europe is going to be spending a ton of money on Ukrainian reconstruction anyway. We all feel an obligation to help Ukraine recover from Russia's aggression. So it would be smart for all of us, for Ukraine, for the European Union, for the United States as well, to make sure that this money is put to work to help Ukraine develop a rule of law environment, a vibrant private sector, as Aleš said, so that Ukraine grows and is better as part of our community. I think what we'll find is that a Ukraine part of the EU is better for the EU. A Ukraine relegated to a gray zone is dangerous for the EU.
As we continue our discussion, I would like to remind our members of the audience you can submit questions using the GlobeSec app or online directly via Slido at hashtag GlobeSec2022MT. And there are also some research surveys in the app. Katarína, the European Commission in 2020 voted on these new measures to make the enlargement process more credible, more dynamic. And prior to that, the shortest approval period has been 3 to 5 years. That was back in 1995 for Austria, Finland, and Sweden. But French President Emmanuel Macron has said it could take decades for Ukraine to become a member of the EU. With this change that you voted on in 2020, how short could the timeline be?
Well, I think that's a little bit of crystal balling, but I think that the relevant comparison is probably the 2004 enlargement and the 2007 enlargement rather than Finland, Austria, Sweden, which were completely different systems, right? So I would compare it to the post-communist countries where it took around 7 years. In the case of Czech Republic, Poland, maybe a year less for Slovakia because we were catching up. But so somewhere between that and decades is probably where I would put it. But there is one important element that I would like to dispel: this notion that some countries have been waiting for a long time and suddenly somebody was jumping the queue. This is part of the problem, that some countries who are in the enlargement anteroom are actually not as active on a number of fundamental reforms. And I would really like to underscore that Ukraine after the war would not be starting from scratch, because as part of what we have had over the last 6-7 years, working on ever since the Maidan Revolution, when the association agreement was signed and the something called Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, DCFTA, actually is a new kind of agreement that contains a lot of the norms and regulations of the EU, about 70% of them. So in effect, a lot of it has been done. We have worked on reforms and supporting the reforms and pushing the reforms very, very much over the last several years. My second job is heading something called Support Group for Ukraine. And therefore, if it starts the enlargement process, it would not be starting from zero. It's actually very advanced, and a number of steps have already been taken, both legislatively, institutionally, in terms of setting up structures. And I think this is important to remember.
Could you give us a rough time estimate, though, if with that having happened already?
Look, I think that Ukraine, with its energy, determination, resilience, I think would be surprising many how quickly it can move. And the process then depends also on the desire of the individual country, but it probably would be difficult to do it in a shorter period of time than the 2004 enlargement. But I would take the liberty of not calling it a number of decades. I think it would be a lot faster.
Oleksandr,
If the door is open.
what are your thoughts on what she just said? And would you like to elaborate on the steps that you have already taken due to this association agreement with the EU in 2014, and how much further down the road it puts you? So as Katarína said, it's not like you are starting from zero and jumping in front of others who've been waiting in line.
Despite very difficult conditions and despite war, we made impossible in terms of economic reforms, and especially recent land reform, which is one of the examples. And I'm sure that, as far as I know, 70% of what was envisaged in the association agreement has already been performed by Ukraine. But to me, it's not only about legal issues. It's not about Copenhagen criteria. To me, it's more a matter of political will. And all the members of the EU can be divided into two categories, at least to me. Our reliable partners, our true friends who want to see us in the European Union. Poland, Baltic states, Slovakia, I hope, and some other countries. And there are also unreliable partners who are trying to find pretext to keep Ukraine away from the European Union. And I'm afraid that they might be trying to find any pretext to keep us away, using different legal nuances, for example. And it would be really unfair to Ukraine. So I rely on support of our friends, and I hope that they will manage to persuade those who are hesitant.
Aleš, what do you think the EU can and should be doing right now as this process begins to encourage Ukraine and to further integrate it?
Well, there are two major dimensions of this. I mean, the first one is, of course, the willingness of member states to acknowledge, by giving the candidate status to Ukraine, that finally and ultimately Ukraine can and will enter inside the EU, which is a complicated question for some member states because it would define or redefine to a large extent what the EU is today. With 27 member states, you already hear from major member states a discussion on the way how we take decisions internally, on how much time sometimes, even for very simple issues, we cannot agree. And even before the war, when we talked about Western Balkans and their integration, the debate on our internal decision-making was major, I would say, condition for further enlargement of the EU. Why am I saying this? Is that the first task for the EU is to work internally on a discussion which has now been kicked off by different speeches and by the Conference on the Future of EU on how we manage internally inside the EU to get it more flexible and ready for enlargement. And this is a big task. So there is an internal dimension of preparing for accession of Ukraine. On the external one, I would dare to say that at the current moment, and this is what has not been mentioned, considering the situation on the ground, we are focusing on really concrete, be it humanitarian or military, or also political, when possible and when efficient, steps and messages towards Ukraine to get out of the current situation. Of course, we have already plans, and during our presidency, we also want to kick them off on further motivation for Ukraine to implement reforms, to reconstruction, which is extremely, which might be one of the major topics if the situation on the ground allows. But momentarily, what we try to do is to help Ukraine in the days and hours and weeks, which will be key for deciding its future and the future of the EU in that sense. So.
Kurt, I hesitate to ask you to elaborate much regarding reconstruction, because it feels premature. As a war is still raging and people are still dying, but I know we need to be forward-looking. So on that point, how can reconstruction be used to help move this membership, the EU membership process, forward for Ukraine?
Well, first off, I appreciate your question, but my view is the opposite, that it is not too early to talk about reconstruction. Russia has damaged a lot of things in Ukraine, and Ukraine's economy has taken a big hit. Estimates are as much as 25% of GDP, which is massive. And what Ukraine needs to sustainably go forward, to continue its defeating of Russia as it attacks Ukraine, is to get the economy back on its feet. And that requires exports, particularly the agricultural exports that we're all talking about now, trying to unblock the port of Odessa, getting investment into the country, repairing infrastructure, so that Ukraine is able to strengthen itself while continuing to deal with this aggression. So I think it's not too late to talk about, or too early to talk about that. And the second thing is that you're an expert on hurricane recovery.
Disasters.
You formed your hurricane, and you formed your nonprofit on that. When you build back after something like this, there is an opportunity to build back with better infrastructure, better digital infrastructure, better standards and regulations. It's an opportunity to get the legislation, the regulations, and the technology all aligned with the rest of Europe. So it can actually be speeding up Ukraine's European integration if we all work together, coordinate, and use the reconstruction effort wisely.
Katarína, I'd like to talk about some of the alternatives that some have discussed to EU membership, something in the middle. I know Kurt said having Ukraine in a gray area is not a good thing, but some of the proposals include a commitment to granting a candidate status at a later date, or there's also this idea about making it part of sort of a looser network of countries associated with the EU but without a member status. Do you want to comment on these? Tell us how they would work, potentially?
No. I am a strong believer in Ukraine needing to get a perspective to join the EU. And I very much agree with, and I don't know whether Kurt mentioned it here or in the previous debate that we had. No, you mentioned it here too, that I do believe European Union would be stronger with Ukraine, with the dynamism, resilience of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian institutions, right? We all were subject to this narrative, oh, they're so corrupt, they're practically a failed state. And then the war starts, and the best humanitarian delivery happens via the Ukrainian government. I mean, this is really, the war is showing completely different Ukraine that many people didn't know. And the perception that Ukrainians are the same as Russians has fallen on its face. And so I right now, when we were drafting the opinions that are going to be adopted at my house because I couldn't go to the office, it's very much based on the perspective. And I hope that, as my president yesterday mentioned, I hope that we will have the leaders of 27 agreeing to that. And I think that it's going to, if they're granted the perspective, it would be an essential element also for the recovery. And we have published a communication 2 weeks ago on the recovery. We are right now actually drafting the platform where we where we want to, as President announced yesterday, coordinate the international effort, because it's going to have to be all hands on deck. The US, Canada, the G7, the IFIs, and most notably Ukrainian counterparts, both at the governmental and non-governmental level, working towards the recovery.
Oleksandr, I was wondering if you would comment on those two options. Would anything like that be acceptable to you?
Of course, it's not acceptable, and I'm afraid that these ideas, these plans by some Western politicians, they're devised with the goal to keep us away from the European Union. And I think that we deserve that the member states of the European Union should treat us in honest and fair way. And they should directly and openly, if they, for example, disagree with our membership, and to tell it openly and explain why. For example, we deserve it. But I hope that the justice will prevail in the final analysis, and Ukraine will become a member of the European family to which we have always belonged.
Aleš, you mentioned earlier how the Czech Republic is going to be taking up the presidency of the Council of the European Union in the second half of 2022, and you said that would give you some ability to help Ukraine. Could you be a little more specific about actions you think that you could take to really move the ball forward?
Well, both of them are related actually to the topics of this discussion, which is the first, the European perspective and how to implement it, because giving the European perspective in the conclusions this month is just the first step. Then you have, of course, the candidate status as such, which is nevertheless not substantiated unless you have negotiation frameworks which are defined, unless you can really start to open chapters and see and somehow monitor what steps Ukraine would need to do. So in case that we have a positive assessment from the European Council in June, and it will still be difficult to reach one in between now and then we can start to work really very much concretely on trying to start the negotiations, because this is where the real process starts. And the process itself, it's, one can say the way is the road, or the road is the goal, or it's the destination to some extent. The process counts in the EU, and it already, as it was in our case before 2004, it increases credibility, for example, for investment and for future perspective. I mean, the biggest investments have poured into my country well before the membership, when it was already clear that the process has started and that we were going inside the EU. So it's not just about the one moment when Ukraine enters, it is also about the process. So this is something that we hope to be able to start to kick off. And the other one, very, very important, is to talk about reconstruction of Ukraine, about how exactly actually we can contribute, and what will be also the legal basis for these activities. I think that EU candidate status or EU membership would be the best way. Other ways that we will need to pay attention to, of course, is that we do not send mixed messages to other countries. I mean, waiting, as Katarína has maybe not, or would not choose the language, but indeed also having heterogeneous efforts to enter the EU. So we need to think about them also, and of course also about, and Ukraine is by far the priority, but we also need to take a larger perspective in terms of for the countries of associated trio, which are territorially and potentially for the future in a very similar situation as Ukraine. So we should also not forget them. Of course, it's not for tomorrow, but we should not be, and I also suppose that the conclusions in the European Council will mention them. Of course, the space devoted to Ukraine would be much, much bigger, but we should not forget about this. So these are, in a nutshell, the activities we want to do. And in the meantime, we'll also try to facilitate as much of current, day-to-day support for Ukraine.
Kurt, it's been reported that 91% of Ukrainians now support EU membership, which is an extraordinary number. But also, it's being reported that most people in Europe, most in European countries now also support their membership. Is that a sign of some momentum? And does that make it increasingly important for the EU to really act now. I heard someone say recently, you know, where the people are, the politicians will follow.
Right. This is exactly right. So there's a time lag involved here. You have, first off, the situation on the ground, where Ukraine has defended its country, its independence, its sovereignty, still fighting, but has established itself. Then you have public opinion, which recognizes the resilience, the determination, the courage of Ukrainians, and sees them now for the first time, as Katarína said, not as post-Soviet, not as hopelessly corrupt, not as somehow mini-Russians. They're Ukrainians and they're Europeans, and people see that. And then the lagging indicator is European governments, which are used to doing things minimally, half-step, slowly, no risk, and it's the publics that they ultimately respond to. What I think is important, therefore, is this not to be just a short-term phenomenon of changing perceptions. It's important that we keep Ukraine on the front pages. The war's not over. They still need support and help, despite the courage and the resilience that they're showing. They still need help. This war has to come out the right way for all of our interests, including European and American interests. And then we need to keep the focus on supporting the Ukrainians in their recovery. And if we can keep up that public sentiment that I think is very, very strong today, where people understand Ukraine in a way they didn't before, governments will catch up.
We are going to go to questions now, both from our audience, but I'll start with some that have been coming in on Slido. Those in the room, after we go through this first question, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then when I call on you, we'll have a microphone brought to you. So this is a question that came in from Linda Tutova. She asks, the EU has recently synchronized its power grid with Ukraine and Moldova. And here it is. What are the next steps? What other areas where these efforts may be replicated? Would like to take that.
I'll volunteer, but
okay.
First of all, this is a fantastic example of the accelerating function of the war. We were discussing, and Alan will remember that we've been discussing this synchronization for a long time, and there was always some bureaucratic obstacle and why this was taking longer. And suddenly there was a test run, and the Ukrainians disconnected themselves also on behalf of Moldova of the Russian grid, and then the Russians were not going to reconnect them. So suddenly it happened. The next steps of it is to actually start trading with the electricity, which is, so the commercial interconnection hasn't happened yet, but the energy market in general is one that is very ripe. We have energy union. There is a lot of the acquis, of the norms that Ukrainians have already adopted. They have built a lot of the structures for the interdependency. So I think the energy sector in general is ripe for much more interconnection. And the second one, which is very obvious, is telecom and IT. I mean, one thing that we need to remember, that they have leapfrogged Ukrainians. Even during the war, they are actually adding services on the DIA application on a weekly basis. So this is an area where there is quite a lot of synchronization already, and this is where I think the internal market treatment, the magic formula for bringing them into the internal market, is most ripe. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, no, exactly. And I'm just going to agree with you and add on to it. So, but I want people to think for a second. Before Ukraine had linked itself to the European electricity grid, Russia was attacking Ukraine consistently for 8 years. They had occupied Crimea, they had taken part of Donbass, they're attacking every day, 15,000 people killed, and Ukraine was nonetheless linked to Russia and Belarus for the stability of its electricity. This is crazy. This is absolutely insane. And so to be able to get out of that, thanks to the bigger war that Putin started, European Union acted with much greater speed than normal and said, okay, we're going to do this. And Ukraine is now linked to the EU and not to Belarus and Russia. Russia has knocked out a significant portion of Ukraine's electricity consumption because of the war. So Ukraine's actually in the position of being able to export electricity to the EU based on what they have, as opposed to the other way around. And if you look at the geography and the timelines that the European Union has set, the European Union has set goals for renewable energy as a portion of Europe's electricity mix, energy mix, by 2030, by 2050. And the countries that are closest to Ukraine are among those that are furthest away from the EU's own targets. And they're using Russian oil and gas, which the EU is acting as as much as it can, given given the consensus, given the member states. But it is gradually moving away from Russian oil, moving away from Russian gas. Investment in Ukraine in energy production, particularly electricity production, which is very favorable for renewables, would then be able to export electricity back to the EU, solve EU problems, create growth in Ukraine, and help integrate Ukraine into Europe. So this is exactly the kind of issue. It's a great question because it illustrates very concretely how Ukraine is a solution for Europe rather than a problem.
Do we have any questions in the room? Right here. And do you want to identify yourself?
Alan
please?
Riley, who knows this better than I do.
Or maybe he has answers.
Yes. Well, I'm not going to actually. Sorry, Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. I'm not going to sort of repeat what Kurt's just said on the energy thing, but I think it's a very good example of how Ukraine actually adds value to Europe, even in the middle of a war, and even in all the situations they're facing. They're actually providing export power to Europe, and I think that's great. I actually wanted to come back to the accession issue. Now, I have in my past had to deal with accession, estates and everything. It's 35 chapters. It takes very long. The mind-numbingly grinding process of those 35 chapters is pretty terrible. And one question which actually I'd thought about way before Ukraine, way before this situation, was why don't we split it up? And some of the initial chapters deal with what's called the fundamentals. Rule of law, sort of independent courts, anti-corruption, and so on. And what I think is possible, and this is perhaps a question to Katarína and some of the others that may have a view, could we cut it up into two parts?
So unlink it.
Unlink it. And I think there are tremendous advantages of having two stages, where you first of all focus on the core, I say, human rights, the courts, anti-corruption, and so on. And the idea is that is done absolutely and clearly first. And once you do that, first of all, once you pass stage one, there is then some goodies which could include full freedom of movement. It could include, for example, 50% access to EU funds and elected MEPs with observer status. For example, I'm just giving you some examples.
So not only unlinking, but you're saying a graduated entry.
Yeah, and then
into the EU.
And the reason for this is that once you've got those fundamentals absolutely in place, then all the other chapters, consumer protection, all the other stuff, on the other chapters, the other 30 or so chapters, it's much more rapid. You have greater sense of integrity that the thing will happen and be really in place. But crucially, once those chapters in place, in terms of what Kurt was saying earlier about foreign investment coming in, the foreign investors will be even more convinced that then it's worth coming in. What you're trying to do here is to create a super strong fast track, in the sense that everyone can see the direction. It may take until 2030 to absolutely complete, but then you're on a fast track. Everybody knows that the rule of law and all the other stuff is in place. You get some goodies to start you off, so there's a reward, and then you move forward rapidly with all the investment coming in.
Great.
That's my thought.
Terrific. Katarína, what do you think?
Good question, and some of it is already thought about and other things will be on the table. You asked earlier, and I realized I never responded. There has been a new approach where we actually cut up the 35 chapters into 6 clusters. Right, and the rule of law, so 6 groupings, and the rule of law needs to be. You cannot move to a new cluster unless the rule of law is actually done. My only comment on it is that the expectation of what rule of law brings takes actually the longest. So you get into a chicken and egg a little bit, because you actually don't want to wait with some of the grindingly, numbingly boring ones to, forever. But this idea that you actually address the fundamentals first is already built into the structure. So you can open, but you cannot close any of the other clusters unless the rule of law is done.
Oleksandr, do you want to comment on that, or Alash?
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, just one remark, and I completely agree, and it is partially part of the new methodology of enlargement, which would most probably apply also to Ukraine if we define it in the negotiation frameworks. I think that this is a very good point, as rule of law is really an open gate for every other reform, for every other chapter. At the same time, it is also the most difficult one. And when you look actually at the processes in Western Balkans, this is actually the one that is sometimes even more difficult than those technicalities and irritating things like in the Czech case, it was water treatment, sugar production, for example, and then minor issues with, for example, butchery, hygiene. So those are things that I think we could and should be able to skip in a way, but then it would require also sort of slightly new approach to the membership per se. And what we are discussing, what we have been discussing before the war for Western Balkans, is the concept of staged accession, which would give something very much tangible on the way towards the EU as soon as possible, as soon as clear conditions are met in different chapters or in different clusters, or even choosing a new type of methodology. So there is a way to, cut it up and to be able to offer something, against it. One last point is that something that we need to offer on that staged way is money, and it's cohesion money, because this is the logic that it should be also phasing in somehow when the country approaches the EU. The issue now that seems as a technicality is that our multi-annual financial framework will end in 2027, and in the meantime it's very much difficult, as I sometimes say, I'm not sure it's in English, to squeeze a mosquito into the budget. But we will need to find a way, and money, cohesion money, or let's say contributions from EU funds are key part of this staged accession, access to single market, of course, and to giving a tangible perspective that the EU membership, once it comes, has already brought some benefits on the road.
Oleksandr, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if something can be done in a simple way and quickly, there is no need to do it in a long way and a difficult, complicated way. And as for rule of law, I'm a lawyer myself, and I have published an article on rule of law. We have rule of law in Ukraine right now, because rule of law is the opposite of rule of person. For instance, in Russia, they don't have rule of law. They have rule of Putin. Ukraine is democracy. We have rule of law. And of course, maybe it's not ideal, but we are working on it.
I see we have some questions in the room up here. If you want to identify yourself, please.
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein, Vice President of Globsec, and I want to come back to the candidate status question. And, I think one of the best arguments to have it as soon as possible and best before summer is to say that in the second half of the year there may be ceasefire negotiations, and it is elementary for that moment to have Ukraine's geopolitical position crystal clear. To have a clear expression, both from the EU side and from the Ukrainian side, where Ukraine wants to be and where it will be. And my question to Mathernová, is that argument made sufficiently in the discussions in, Brussels and the capitals of the member states such as Germany and France? And are you really using this, or is it useless? You tell us, please.
It's not necessarily part of the discussion because it is assumed, because, we are true believers, and it was very reassuring to get it so clearly and on the record from our president yesterday, right, where she spoke about moral duty, as you referred to. I think this argument is perhaps not sufficiently made in all of the capitals, and it's part of the narrative we have been advising our Ukrainian friends, because they're now actively going around. The president appointed 4 emissaries. One of them was here, Olga, to go and tour the capitals. And this is part of the narrative that they need to be employing. But I think that what we are experiencing, and I think that what Kurt mentioned, that first reality on the ground, then public opinion, and then governments catch up, is that what I've been saying for a long time, people in Europe or in the world did not know Ukraine. And were, even the government experts were the Russia experts on both sides of the Atlantic in number of governments. So suddenly you're discovering a new polity, and you really need to understand both Ukraine and have a geopolitical view to be open to this argument. So I think it's a very good argument and needs to be made very consistently and with urgency right now.
So we have time for a very brief question. This gentleman here.
Milan Nič, German Council of Foreign Relations, formerly Globsec. I will continue on the candidacy status question. As you know, and I will address it, Aleš, to you. As you know, this will be a decision by the member states. So the deliberation among the member states is the key. Now, the mechanism is that the Commission will publish the opinion in 2 weeks, probably positive, on Ukraine, but also on others. And then the member states will come with their own approach. What do you hear? How do you see the dynamics among the 27? And can you share with us, maybe, if you put countries into the boxes, I heard that it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 skeptics, 1/3 enthusiasts here in this room, in majority, and 1/3 somewhere in between. And I would just add one thing to this question. It's, of course, not viewed only on the merits of Ukraine, because Ukraine is entering, if you are given a candidate status, you will be part of a process which is not working. And all these nice things that you, Alan, and others mentioned, didn't work for the Western Balkans.
Right. Let's give him time to answer. Thank you.
Yeah. So very briefly, I would recall one situation which was in late 1970s when the European Commission has, if I'm not mistaken, submitted an avis on Greek membership.
I was still in school. So.
Yeah. No, I'm looking at the Commission and the institution. So. But it published an avis which was basically negative, and it was overridden by the Council and by the European Council. And by the way, European Council decides just politically. The Council will then need to approve, of course. But the main thing here is that indeed it is a political decision. It is just a background paper, not to diminish its importance, but it is a sort of a background paper or an argument for the Council to do so. I completely agree that it is roughly divided in 3/3, the overall debate. As for now, if the European Council had a session today or tomorrow, I'm afraid that the result will not, the conclusions would not include the words of candidate status. I would be positive that as for now, as for tomorrow, there would be a European perspective, which is something which is tangible. In some member states, it is even understood as legally binding to a large extent. So it is, an European perspective is a big thing. It is something that we have been trying for Ukraine, for associated countries in the past 5 years, very much intensively, and we did not get it. So this is where I think that the debate will go. It will be about the concrete language and the concrete formulation, maybe a little bit more than about, 0 or none. It will not be a binary debate. It will be very much, I expect, long and on the text. And I hope, and this is my major maybe wish, sorry to prolonging it, but my major wish is that it could be something understood positively in Ukraine, because this is immediately what we need, is a positive message.
Oleksandr, do you want to have the last word?
Well, I'm trying to foresee what might be the outcome, the result of this summit, and who are, so to speak, Ukraine's skeptics. I'm trying to identify these countries, and the thing is that it's difficult to do. I suspect Germany and France, that they might be against. But France says, no, we are okay, we support Ukraine, it's Germany probably. And Germany says, no, we are fine, we support you, but it's not clear who is against our status as a candidate.
Those who are dependent on Russian oil.
Yeah, probably it's like economic explanation is the best explanation. Yes, probably yes.
Well,
I'll tell you
okay,
outside.
Kurt,
I want to close on
next
one.
to final
I want to
word.
give one word to cause people to think as we go out. Momentum. Ukraine is winning on the ground, but we need to make sure they win politically and economically, and we have to use the EU summit and use our relationships to create momentum.
May I add
yes,
one
go ahead.
sentence? I think what Aleš mentioned really needs to be hammered home also in Ukraine. The key, the dividing line is to give you European perspective. Last year, the year before, we only acknowledged your aspirations to be part of the Union. If you are affirmatively told you have European perspective, whether you are a candidate or not is not changing things. There is really too much concentration on the word candidate. What you really need is European perspective of becoming a member of the European Union, black on white.
We have had fabulous momentum all day throughout the second day of the Globsec Bratislava Forum. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers who have been participating, our fabulous audience that has given us great questions, and unfortunately we had some on Slido we weren't able to get to, but thank you everyone. A couple of housekeeping details. The bus for the cocktail and concert in support of Ukraine leaves from the Ground Hotel River Park lobby at 7:40, and then the cocktail and concert for the support of Ukraine will take place at the Capitol at 8:30. Please join me, all of you here in the room, in welcoming, thanking our terrific panel. You are just wonderful. Katarína, Oleksandr, Aleš, Kurt. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone.